Okay. There you go. Can you all see my screen?
Yeah.
All right, cool. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Introduction to React and Redux workshop. My name is Darth. I am a second-year stats major here in UC Davis.
My name is Shivam, and I'm a second-year CS major at UC Davis.
And I'm Franklin. I'm a second-year computer science major at UC Davis.
All right. Here's the link to the GitHub repository. We'll have some of the code there. We will be explaining it. Let me know if the QR code does not work. We have the link right on the left. I'll give you all some time to look into it. I'll also, oops. Yeah, I'll put in the chat. Well, we'll go to the next slide.
So what we're going to start with today is installing React. So the first thing we need for React is the Node Package Manager, NPM. So you do see the website link. You can just head to nodejs.org and download and install the LTS version, which is like recommended for most users. And then on your command terminal, what you want to do is run npm install-g npm. What it does is it updates your node to the latest version. And then you can cd into your preferred directory and run npm create React app, my app, where my app can be the name for any app that you choose. And you've created your first React app. And then you just cd into my app and run npm start. And then on your preferred browser, on localhost 3000, you'll see a web page like this in the picture. And that's your first React app.
All right, so before working with React and Redux, one thing you should know is you should have some basic understanding of HTML and JavaScript, since React and Redux usually work with these languages. And I posted, you see the links to some HTML and JavaScript tutorials on the slide. But for this tutorial, if you're not familiar with HTML and JavaScript, that's fine. I'll basically briefly go over some HTML and JavaScript as we go on. And also make sure you understand some of the ES6 features of JavaScript as well. So I've also included a link on that. Okay. So first, let's go over what React is. So React is a JavaScript library that is used to build user interfaces or UIs. In simplified terms, UIs are basically web pages that the user can interact with, such as the login page, as you see below. It's currently one of the most popular libraries for building user interfaces. What you can do with React is you can use it to build interactive and reusable components that users can interact with on your web page. For example, below you see a sign up and login page. You could have a component for the sign up button and then the login button, and different components for each text box like email and password, or you could have a component that includes multiple elements like the entire sign up panel or the entire login panel. And what you can do with these components is that you can basically interchange them use them multiple times on the same web page or on different web pages. Okay. So here's a brief overview of React. So earlier in the previous slide, I talked about components. So each component is typically implemented as a JavaScript function, such as one that may return a button to be displayed on the page, or more commonly, it's implemented as a JavaScript class. So the class will usually include an object called state and a function called render, as you see in the example below. So the render function basically returns what the render function basically returns what we want to render or display on the UI, such as a form or all parts of the login page, including the text boxes and buttons. In other words, the render function basically describes what the UI should look like. Now, the state is a built-in object in React that contains the information we want to display. Like if this information changes, the state will be updated and the render function will be called again to return the updated state to be displayed. So for example, if your UI displays the current time in hours, minutes, and seconds, that time will change every second. So therefore, the state, which contains the current time, will be updated every second. And each time it's updated, React calls the render function in the class component again to return the updated current time. And so also the state doesn't have to be an object. It can also be passed in as parameters to in the constructor for the class, as you will see in the demo we do later in this tutorial. So there are two main benefits to React. So first is that React makes it easy to create interactive UIs. So if you recall, I discussed in the previous slide that the render function in a class component returns syntax that describes what the UI should look like. What it returns is specifically called a React element, which is a JavaScript object that represents or maps to a DOM or DOM element in memory. For those of you who are unfamiliar with JavaScript, the DOM is the document object model, which is a programming API that defines the logical structure of documents. Basically, it's an object that represents, in this case, the web page you want to display information on. And so React keeps a lightweight representation of the DOM called the virtual DOM or the React DOM, and it's much cheaper to create. And if we change the state of an element in the React DOM, we get a new React element, and React will then compare this element with the previous one, figures out what changed, and then update a part of the real DOM to keep it in sync with the virtual DOM. And so the bottom line is basically that it's simpler to change information displayed on UI with React than with just JavaScript. With JavaScript, it would require more code, such as attaching event handlers and also manipulating the DOM directly. Also, another main benefit is that React components are pretty interchangeable. They can basically be reused with other components without any configuration. So now that we've discussed a brief overview of React, we can go into some basic React concepts. So what you need to know first is JSX. So earlier I talked about that the render function and class components returns React elements, which is what the UI should look like. It returns this React element in the form of JSX, which is an extension to JavaScript. It has elements of both JavaScript and HTML in this syntax. So if you recall in HTML, let's say, for example, you want to write and display an article on your web page with the title HTML example. Now, since it's the title, you want to display it in a bigger font. So what you do is you create an HTML element. And how you create that is each HTML element you create in your HTML file must start with opening tags, which consist of the opening and closing angle brackets with the name of the HTML element inside. And then after that, you want to create the closing tags, which is the same set of angle brackets, and then the same HTML element name inside with a slash before the name of the element. And between these pairs of opening and closing angle brackets, you want to type in the content. So what you want to display on the page in that HTML element. So here you see the HTML element is called H1. H1 means the most important heading on the page, which will be displayed as the biggest font. So that's what you want if you want, such as something like the title of an article or a page. And you see that between we have the content, which is HTML example, and this basically represents what you see on the right. This is what it looks like when it's displayed and rendered on the page. It's like a big, in big bold font HTML example. And now you see on the bottom, we have an example of JSX. It's pretty similar. You basically assign the HTML element to a const variable in JavaScript. Now, a const variable in JavaScript is a variable that cannot be changed once it is initialized. So you can't reassign it to anything else. And so here, the HTML element that's being assigned is actually called a React element. That's what JSX is. So here is an example of JSX in action. You see, over here we have the HTML file on the left. On the right, we have the JavaScript file. And for now, don't pay attention to any of the lines you see, except for what's in the parentheses of the root.render function. You see in the parentheses, it's an HTML element, the H1 element that's called JSX example, and you see the output at the bottom, the header, H1 header JSX example. And so next, what you need to know is you can also embed expressions in JSX using curly braces. So over here in the right panel, the JavaScript file, on the first two lines, you see we have a variable called name that is a string, Gunrock Mustang, okay? And then below that, we have the React element. Once again, it's an H1 element, and the content is hello name, and name is the variable we initialize on line 1 to Gunrock Mustang. And when you do that, you have to put curly brackets around it. So when you put expressions in the content of a React element, you have to put curly braces around it. And you can put any expression, such as 3 + 2, or the attribute of an object like user.firstname, or you can even return values that are returned from a function, such as manipulate name of user. And so here we have a detailed JSX example that involves embedding expressions. So first, the React element we want to render starts on line 10. It's the const element, and it's an H1 element. And inside we have hello format name user. That is the string that's returned from the function format name we have on line 1. Now, if you go to format name, you see it takes in an object called user, and it returns the user's first name and a space, and then the user's last name. Now, on line 5, you see we've initialized an object called user that has the first name of Gunrock and the last name of Mustang. And then in the element what we call format name user, we call format name, and then the user parameter is actually the user we initialized on line 5. So it's going to return the user's first name, Gunrock, plus a space, plus the user's last name, which is Mustang, and that's the content which will be rendered as you see below. Now, so we've talked about that you can put expressions in JSX, but you can also use JSX as an expression. So you can assign it to variables. You can use it, JSX, in if statements or for loops. You can return it from functions, and you can also accept JSX as arguments. So you see below that we have a function called getGreeting. It takes in a user object, and you see if user basically means if the user object isn't null or undefined, because in JavaScript, null values or undefined values are evaluate to false. So if the user is not null and not undefined, it basically returns JSX of hello format name user, as in the previous example. But if it is null or undefined, it returns the H1 element hello stranger. And you can also specify attributes with JSX. So in HTML, an attribute is something you put after the element name in the opening tags to to provide more additional information about the element. So in HTML, the A element represents hyperlinks. So here we have a link called link to JS. And you see above, we have in the opening, between the opening and closing angle brackets, we have an attribute href equals www.reactjs.org. Now href basically is the link, the URL that you will be redirected to when you click on the content link to JS that makes up the A element. So when you click on this, it will take you to the website on the right. And you can also embed expressions in attributes with JSX. So if you initialize the URL to a string separately, you can do href equals URL and then enclose it in curly brackets. And finally, you can nest elements with JSX. So there are a couple more HTML elements we'll go over here. H2 element is the second most important header element, but it has a smaller font than H1. So down below, you see hello is an H1 element, so it's bigger font, and then good to see you here is an H2 element, which is displayed right below it, and it has a smaller font. So H2 elements are usually used for subsections within an article, so maybe subtitles. And the div element is usually to symbolize different sections of a page. So for example, in the earlier example, we had a sign up panel and a login panel. In HTML, if you were making that page with HTML, you would usually have a separate div for the sign up panel and a separate div for the login panel. And you will put the HTML elements that belong to each panel inside the corresponding div. So that's what we are seeing here. You see that H1 and H2 headers are nested in the div element. And then the const element, the React elements of that is the entire div and what's inside it. So now we can talk about rendering elements. So earlier I told you that you want to ignore these lines, the other lines. Now we can talk about what they do. So elements, React elements are the smallest building blocks of React applications, and an element describes what you want to see on the screen. Now, when using React, you will usually have a separate HTML file, as you see on the left, that contains a div element. This div element, by convention, has an ID called root, ID attribute called root, as you see on the first line, that's specified. And then this is called, this div element is called a root DOM node, because everything in it is managed by the React DOM. Everything that React renders, updates, and everything else will be done within this div element. So you need to create a div element in order for React to work. And so on the right, you have the code to render a simple hello world H1 element. Now the first line, React DOM.createRoot creates the root DOM node. And inside you have document.getElementById root. That basically returns the HTML element in the HTML file with an ID attribute equal to root and sets that as the React DOM node. So it gives React an entry point into managing the web page. And then the second line, root.render, uses the React DOM node to now render this JSX hello world onto the page. So as an aside, earlier I've discussed that the class component contains a state object and the render function. And the render function returns basically the JSX that describes what you want to render. Now, the root.render function is not the same as the render function in the class component, because the render function inside the class component returns the element to render, and then root.render actually displays this element onto the screen. So, and then also, there's another way to render elements as well. There's another method called React DOM.render, and this takes two parameters: the element you want to render and the React DOM node or the root element. And finally, React elements are immutable, which means they can't be changed once they are created. Once you create an element, you basically can't change its children or its attributes or its content. And usually, instead, in order to update the UI, or you have to create a new element and then pass it to root.render to be rendered again. So then it renders the updated element. So now, next slide, please. Next slide. Okay. So as to see what I mean, let's go over this example. Okay. So we have a function tick that renders hello world, which is the H1 element, and then the H2 element, it is, and whatever you see inside the curly brackets, that basically displays the current time, okay? And then you have the last line of the tick function is root.render element. And then here we have, at the bottom, we have set interval tick 1000. That basically calls the function tick every 1000 milliseconds. So it calls the function tick every second. And each time the tick function is called, it's going to create a new React element with the new updated current time, because the second is going to change every second. And then it's going to render the new updated time. So if you render this, you will see the time on this page change every second to reflect the current time. So now we can go to part 3, which is components and props. So now we can finally see what a class component looks like and how it's implemented in the code. So components are like JavaScript functions. They accept arbitrary inputs called props and return React elements. So props is an object that React will automatically pass to the component. And it's an object that contains one or more parameters, and you specify these parameters when you create an instance of the component. So the simplest way to define a component is a JavaScript function, as you see in the first example here, that accepts props and returns a React element. We call this a function component. A more common way to implement a component is to write a JavaScript class. Now you see here, it's class welcome extends React.component. All class components have to extend React.component. So the React.component is basically a built-in class in React that all class components have to extend from. And then in this class, we have a render function, and it returns an H1 element. And here it is. You see the content is hello this.props.name. And that refers to the props object that was passed to this class, and it should have an attribute inside this props object called name. And this.props.name refers to the value of that name. And one thing you should know is that props are read-only. So a functional class component must never modify its own props. How can you update the information displayed on a web page? To be rendered, you pass in different props to the class component each time you render. Okay. All right, so here is a big example. This is about how to render a class component. So React components can also, besides HTML elements like H1, H2, etc., React components can also represent the user-defined class components that you create. So let's go over to this example here. On the right side, you have a welcome class component. Inside, it's the render function. Basically, it's the same as we saw on the previous slide. And now let's go down to line 729. On line 9, you do root.render the React element called element. And on line 8, const element equals the welcome. So now the React element's name is welcome, which means the class component welcome that you created. And you pass in an attribute, name equals UC Davis. So what happens here is when you call root.render with welcome name equals UC Davis, React checks the element name, it's welcome. So it goes to the class welcome definition and it automatically passes in the props as an object with the attribute name equals UC Davis. Now, what happens next is it calls the render function. And hello, this.props.name, well, props.name is basically equal to name here, which is UC Davis. And then after that, it returns hello, UC Davis, and that is what gets rendered. That is how you can create your own class component and how you can use it to display information on the web page. And one more thing to cover before we move on to Redux is the Proptypes library. So the Proptypes library in React contains a property called Proptypes, and you can assign this property to any component, and this allows for type checking and makes it easier to debug. And Proptypes are validators that make sure the props object that is inputted to a class component, the attributes inside are valid. So as an example, over here we have the counter.proptypes, which counter we have a class component called counter, and we want to use Proptypes on it. So we do counter.proptypes, which is a JavaScript object. So you have to enclose the attributes in curly braces, and inside we say that counter should accept at least 3 attributes in the props object that gets passed to it. One is value, which is a number and which must be a number and is required. So you have to pass in an attribute called value. And then you also have to pass in 2 functions one is called onIncrement and one is called onDecrement. And then what happens when you include this, if, for example, you pass in the Proptypes where the attribute value is actually a string, which is not okay since it has to be a number, then you will get an error message in the console of your web browser, and you can access that through the developer tools. And so this concludes the basic React tutorial. If you want more info, if you want to continue learning React, I provided the link here that takes you to the first chapter of the online React tutorial.
Hi, so I'm going to talk about, give you a very basic understanding of Redux and how it's used in React. So first, from understanding Redux, we need to understand what state is. React components have a built-in property called state objects. So for instance, your classes in React, they have a basic property, built-in property called state object. Franklin talked about this, and there's a link on the PPT, which gives you a very intuitive example of what state is and how to understand it. I've also posted it in the chat. So what is Redux? Redux is basically a state management tool for JavaScript apps, and it's mostly used with React. Now with React, the state of your application is kept in a store, and each component can access any state that it needs from the store. State management can get complex for very huge apps that have a client and server side. So Redux is just a state management tool that we use to keep processes simple and easy. So this is how Redux works. There are 3 building parts: actions, stores, and reducers. Actions are basically just JavaScript objects that will be a source of information for the store. So so actions have two parts, a type field and the information field. The type field tells us what kind of action is performed, and the other fields will contain the information. So there's an example over here for function add task, through which task is passed, and the type field is add to do. The task is task in this scenario. Reducers are just pure functions that take the current state and action and reduce and return a new state. So in the following example, if you remember the add task function in the previous slide, what happens is the following reducer task takes in an array of tasks and an action. And now, for instance, in our the type in our add task function was add to do. What it does is creates a new task array, and it adds the action.task to that task, and it returns that immutable object. The store is an object which holds the state of an application. So const store equal to create store task list is basically creating a store, and store.dispatch is how we add items to the store. So in our instance, in our example, we've decided to add study, eat, and go to sleep in our store. The steps for installing Redux are fairly simple. You just run the following commands on your terminal: npm install save Redux, npm install save React Redux for using Redux with React, and some additional dev tools that can be needed for Redux.
All right, so that concludes the basic information about React and Redux. So rather than for this this workshop, rather than installing a lot of those packages, what we're going to do is instead we're going to use a online code editor called codesandbox.io. And before we get into this, any other questions about React and Redux? Okay, so the URL is codesandbox.io, and once you enter it, you can create an account with either your GitHub or Google account, as well as entering it anonymously, except it won't save. And once you either make an account or just decide to join anonymously, you will create a sandbox with a template. So there'll be a create sandbox button, and the template we recommend for this demo is React, but we will make some changes with it. And after that, we want to install required dependencies to add and delete files, as well as play around or just do the demo code. So yeah, we'll stop sharing and I will quickly get to the next area we want to do. One quick second. I will share screen. All right. Okay. Let me know if you're able to see. Can you guys see my screen?
Yeah, we can see a screen.
Okay. So this is usually what the template you'll be going into would occur. Module not found because there are some there have been some sort of changes made. So we'll have to we'll alter a bit of the code. So first we don't need styles.css. We can delete that, and we can actually delete public as well, or at least I'll keep it hidden, but we don't technically need it right now. And I'm going to sort of alter a bit of the code, src code. So I'm going to delete all these files. And so for src in the general folder, we're looking for 3 files. So we're going to have index.js. This is essentially your entry code. This is what the you'll put in to display onto the React app. Next is we're going to have 2 folders. We're going to have a components folder for React, and we're going to have a reducers folder for Redux. So we'll have components and reducers, and for in the components, we're gonna have a file. So our demo we'll be working on today will be a simple counter demo. So we'll be using a function called, or a JavaScript file called counter.js. And for reducers, we're gonna have a file. Oops, we're gonna have a file that is going to be, since we're not going to be, we don't have to have like a name for a certain like class or anything. I'll just call it index.js. And those are pretty much all the files you need. Next, we want to install dependencies. So if you go to package.json, you'll have all of this jumble. And you can either, in Code Sandbox, you can either add dependencies manually through add dependencies. However, because just to save some time, if you all have the GitHub, I recommend you opening the, go into the GitHub and opening the package.json file and just copy pasting the code there. So for example, let me do that right now. There we go. And as you can see, it changes a lot on the left side, as well as the versions. And it should be ready to go. So we'll start with counter.js, which I believe Franklin will go over.
So right now, I'm not really able to edit this right now. I'm in it says I'm in read-only mode.
All right, give me one quick second then. Let me do so. Okay, you should be good to go.
Okay.
Let me just share the screen again.
Okay.
Let me just share the screen again and we can get started.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Okay. So let's see. Okay. So I'm gonna be doing the React portion, the counter.js. So what we basically want to create is we want to create first of all, we want to create a counter. This counter will have two buttons, a plus button and a minus button. And to the left of these two buttons, we will have a click, and we will have some text. The text will say click and then a number. And this number, every time we click the plus button, this number will be incremented by 1. And every time we press the minus button, it will go down. So what we're going to do is we're going to first create a class component for the whole counter. So first off, before typing out the code, we need to import the React library from the React. After that, since we're going to use Proptypes for this example as well, so we need to import the Proptypes library. And that's the code for that. Next, after that, now we can create our counter class component. So as before, you do class and then the class name counter and extends react.component. And in this class, we will have the render function. And what we want to do now is we want to first set the different variables for each of the attributes in the props. So in the props, we're expecting, so we should do the prop types first to make this more clear. So in the counter, we're using prop types. Let's see. We want to pass in 3 attributes, a value attribute, which is a number and is required, and 2 function on increment, which is a function and is required, and on decrement, which is a prop types function and also is required. And so now With that, we can go back up. The first thing we want to do in the render function is set different variables to each of these attributes. So how you can do that is you do const value on increment on decrement. And this is how you can initialize multiple values in JavaScript. This dot props. So this automatically sets each of the attributes in this dot props, in the props object passed in to the value on increment and on decrement. Okay, so now, let's see. Now we want to return the element, the counter element. And now we need to emphasize the structure in using JSX. So what we do then, we want to put all the JSX inside this these parentheses. So first off, we want to display the counter as a line of and to do that, we use the P element. P stands for paragraph element in JavaScript. So you use it for paragraphs. You can also use it for anything that you want to display in a few lines or just one line in this case. And so first we have clicked, the text clicked, and then value times, and value in this case, it corresponds to the value that is passed in as props to this counter component. And then after that, we want a button that has a plus on the display of it. And this is the button that when you press it, it will increment value. And then next, after that, we have the minus button. That's where we put, So that's how you do the button element in HTML. Now, if we want a little bit of space between this text times and the plus button, because if we just render it like this, the buttons will basically be right next to each other. They won't. We want a little bit of space next to them. So how do you have a little bit of space? You put a string that consists of a single space enclosed in curly brackets. And let's do the same thing here, so that there can be a little bit of space between the buttons. Let's see. Okay, so we have one more thing to do. We want the value to be incremented when we press the plus, when we click on the plus button. So what we can do is add an attribute called onClick. And this onClick is basically the function that will run, that will be executed once we click on this button. So the function that will be run will be called onIncrement, which will increment the value. And then for the minus button, we have the onClick attribute be the onDecrement function, and these are the functions we pass in as the props. And these two functions will be implemented using Redux. And one last thing we will do here is we will export this counter class component so that we can import it and use it in other files. Let me check to make sure everything's good. Okay, it should be good now.
All right, okay. So once the counter is made, we're also going to add some code to the reducers. So at the moment, it's going to look very, I wouldn't say confusing, because I think this code is pretty it's more like standard JavaScript, but it won't make sense until we get to the main function. So we'll first start with we want to export a default function. So we'll export default, and we're going to have our state, which we mentioned before. It's going to be equal to 0. And we also want to have the action. So that's going to be our two main parameters. And if I just go there, we're going to make so for this JavaScript portion, we want to have a sort of a switch statement based on whether or not we are either incrementing the function or decrementing the function. So let's make a switch function or switch method, switch action. And to find the certain one, we just got to just do the type modifier. And we will be making a switch function here. All right, so now if we want to, let's for a case, let's have a flag called increment in all capitals. And if that case gets received, it's going to return the state, the state, which is the value +1. And that's one of our cases. Next is our case. What if it's decrementing, where our flag will be decrement. We want to return state -1. And finally, we're going to go for our default in case none of those flags are passed. We just want to return the state. So return state. And that should be all that we need for the reducer code. So let's go to the main code. This is going to be where we're going to put everything together and print it on the right over here. So let me so first we need to import a lot of packages. Let's import React. Import React. And I'll quickly minimize this because it will get a bit distracting, especially because as I'm typing, it's going to see a bunch of errors this displaying. So we'll do that from React. Now we want to import. We want the document object model. So DOM from React-DOM. Just do something like this as well. Next, we want to import. So for Redux, we want to import the create store method. So we can just like individually import methods. So like create store from Redux. And now we want to import our two classes. So we want to import the counter class. So we can just go counter from, and to call it from the folder, so you use the ./components/counter. And that should be our counter class. And finally, we want to get our reducers. And since technically we don't have any other files and no specific classes we want to import, we can just use any name. For this, I'll just use lowercase counter from /reducers. So hopefully that should be good to go. And now we will first create a store to hold the values and change it. So const, we're gonna call it store equal to create store. We're gonna create store using the create store method. Create store, and we're gonna use counter. So it'll be based off of the reducer here. Next, we're going to create a document element by ID based off the root. So we're gonna call it root EL equals document dot get element by ID. So let me just get element by ID. And as mentioned before, we're going to use root. So we'll just type root. And those are our two constants. Now we're going to create a render function. Const render equals, let's do this. And then you got to use a redirection arrow here. And we're going to create a React DOM dot render. And let's do this. There we go. So now it's going to render, it's going to start with a counter class. So we can go for counter. You use this flag to get counter. And from here, I'm going to press enter. I'm just going to do this for a bit of like easier to read. So value. So the value will be, this is where we start mixing the reducers with the React. So the value will be the current state of the reducer. So we'll go with store. Sorry, it'll be store dot get state. So this will just get the state of the value. So that's with current value, and then finally, as the next property will be on increment. So let's quickly do this will just be our function. And sorry, this will just be our function. This will only occur when, then this is where we start implementing more of the Redux. So we're gonna quickly make a redirection here, and it's gonna be store. So we're gonna take our store and we're gonna dispatch the function. So whenever, if this function is called, we're gonna dispatch a flag to the store. So if you remember correctly, the flag for incrementing is the all caps increment. So let me quickly do that. So to get that, you just gotta do type, and then in all caps increment. That should be our on increment. And now finally, we're gonna do the same thing with decrement. I'll just copy paste from here, but that's area. We'll just same thing, but just it's gonna be in decrement. So on decrement, we want to do store type increment. So it'll be like so. And those are your three values. So we just want to close it now. So close it, it's going to be fully closed. And finally, we want to add root L to get the document ID. So we just do comma root EL. And it should be good to go. I'm just gonna enter this so just to make it a bit easier to see. And now we're just gonna call the render function. So the moment I do render, if everything works, we should be seeing this to load, as you can tell here. Okay. Okay, here we go. So, and here is our basic counter. You can tell you have clicked 0 times and items like this. So let's press plus by example. Let's see what happens. So as you can see, the buttons aren't working. That's because we need to add one more function at the very end called, we're gonna need the store to subscribe. So it allows us as users to pass subscriptions for the element to use. So we just gotta easily just finish it off by doing store.subscribe. And then we want to subscribe using render. And that should be our final function. And if everything goes well, this should all install. All right, there we go. And now the moment I press plus, it's countering, it's clicked by 1. So I can click it as many times as I want, and it's going up. And if I click minus, every time I click it, it's going to go down. And thus, using React and Redux, we were able to create a basic counter. Any questions? Yeah, sorry if it went a bit too fast there, but hopefully